Sarah accepted a crooked house as payment from her employer. But the reason it was crooked changed her life. Sarah Davies was a widow with 6 children who faced hunger daily. Her millionaire employer offered her an old, crooked house that no one else wanted as payment. It was so tilted, it looked ready to collapse, and everyone said it was worthless. But when she discovered why it was so twisted, when she opened the locked room that caused the entire structure to lean to one side, she realized she had received much more than just a roof. And now she would have to defend with her life what generosity had given her. Tell us in the comments below from which city you are listening, and let's begin the story. The day Sarah Davies saw her husband, David, collapse in the middle of his carpentry workshop, his hand clutched to his chest and his eyes wide with pain, she knew her life had just shattered into pieces. There was no time for goodbyes. No final words, just the dry thud of his body against the concrete floor, her choked cry, and then the eerie silence that settled in their home like a permanent ghost. David was 42, Sarah 38, and they had 6 children to feed. Liam, 14, the twins Ethan and Noah, 11, Emily, 9, little Chloe, 7, and baby Leo, who was barely 2 years old. The first months were a descent into hell. The workshop closed, debts mounted. Creditors arrived at their door demanding payments. Sarah couldn't meet. She sold David's tools, the few good pieces of furniture they owned, even her wedding ring, but nothing was enough. Willowbrook, the town where she had lived all her life, suddenly felt hostile and cold. Old friends looked at her with pity, or worse, with barely disguised scorn. Poor Sarah, they whispered in the market square. How will she manage to feed those 6 children alone? One October afternoon, with an empty stomach and her children crying from hunger at home, Sarah walked to Vance Manor on the outskirts of town. It was an immense property belonging to Mrs. Eleanor Vance, a millionaire woman known throughout the region for her fortune and her difficult disposition. They said she was also a widow, though that had been more than 20 years ago. They said she was as hard as stone and as cold as ice. But they also said she paid well. Sarah knocked on the service entrance with trembling hands. An older woman with a stern face opened the door, looking her up and down with suspicion. "What do you want?" "I've come to ask if you need help," Sarah said, swallowing her pride as if it were ground glass. "I can clean, cook, whatever is needed. I have 6 children and—" "Wait here," the woman interrupted, closing the door in her face. Sarah waited under the blazing sun, feeling the sweat run down her back and shame burn her cheeks. Almost an hour later, the door opened again. This time it was someone else, a tall woman of about 60, elegantly but simply dressed, her silver hair pulled back in an impeccable bun. Her eyes were gray and piercing, as if they could read every secret Sarah tried to hide. "You are David Davies' widow," she said without preamble. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am." "How many children do you have?" "6, ma'am." "And how old is the youngest?" 2 years old, ma'am, Mrs. Vance observed in silence for what seemed like an eternity. Then she nodded slightly. "I need someone to clean, to cook, to take care of the main house. The work is heavy, the hours are long. I don't tolerate laziness or excuses. Can you handle that?" "Yes, ma'am," Sarah responded without hesitation, although she had no idea how she would manage with Leo. "I can handle anything. The pay is fair. You start tomorrow at 6 a.m. Don't be late." And that was all. Mrs. Vance closed the door, and Sarah hurried back home, her heart beating so fast she thought it would burst from her chest. That night, for the first time in months, she managed to buy bread and milk for her children. She watched them eat with a mixture of relief and sadness that tightened her throat. But in town, tongues quickly began to wag. Sarah Davies, the respectable widow, now worked as a housekeeper for the millionaire. What a disgrace! What a fall! The neighbors whispered in the market, in church, on every corner. "She has no dignity," said Mrs. Jenkins, Willowbrook's biggest gossiper. "I'd rather starve than stoop so low." Sarah heard the comments and clenched her fists. But she didn't respond. She couldn't afford that luxury. Her children needed to eat. The first few days at the estate were exhausting. Sarah arrived when it was still dark, leaving Liam in charge of his siblings, and didn't return until the sun had set. The main house was enormous, 3 stories, more than 20 rooms, marble floors that had to be mopped on her knees, immense windows that required hours of cleaning. And Mrs. Vance was demanding, yes, but not cruel. She watched her work with those inscrutable gray eyes, but never yelled at her, never insulted her as Sarah had feared. In fact, there was something strange about the way Mrs. Vance treated her. Sometimes, when Sarah was cleaning the library, she felt the millionaire's gaze upon her. Other times, Mrs. Vance would ask unexpected questions. Does your oldest son go to school? Is the baby healthy? What did your husband study? Sarah responded respectfully, but with honesty. And little by little, something began to change. Mrs. Vance began to give her clothes she no longer used, old toys from her son for Leo, books for Liam, small gestures that Sarah received with immense gratitude. One November afternoon, while Sarah was sweeping the second-floor corridor, she heard loud voices coming from Mrs. Vance's study. It was her nephew and niece, Robert and Victoria Vance, who visited the estate every month, under the guise of checking on their aunt, but who in reality only wanted to ensure their inheritance was intact. "Aunt, it's ridiculous for you to live alone in this enormous house with just one housekeeper," Robert said in a honeyed voice. "You should come live with us in Calgary. We can take better care of you." "I don't need to be taken care of," Mrs. Vance replied, her voice dry as the desert. "And certainly not by you, who are just waiting for me to die to divide what's left." The silence that followed was tense and icy. Sarah remained frozen, broom in hand, not daring to move. Then she heard the furious footsteps of the nephew and niece descending the stairs, their poisonous murmurs. "Stubborn old woman. We'll see who has the last word." That night, as Sarah finished cleaning the kitchen, Mrs. Vance came in with a glass of water, sat at the table, something she never did, and observed her in silence for a long time. "Sarah," she finally said, "what would you do if you had a lot of money and no children of your own?" The question caught her off guard. Sarah put the rag on the sink and turned to her employer. "I don't know, ma'am. I suppose I'd make sure it didn't fall into the wrong hands." Mrs. Vance smiled for the first time. It wasn't a warm smile, but rather a sad, tired one. "You're smarter than you appear," she murmured. Sarah didn't know how to respond, but that conversation stuck in her mind for days. 2 weeks later, on a Saturday afternoon, Mrs. Vance asked her to accompany her to inspect a property she owned on the outskirts of Willowbrook, near the road that led to Port Hope. Sarah left her children with a neighbor and got into the millionaire's SUV, nervous and confused. They arrived at a large, overgrown plot of land where an old timber and stone house stood. But the strangest thing about that house was that it was completely tilted to one side, as if a giant hand had pushed it. The walls curved at impossible angles. The roof looked ready to collapse. The windows were broken. "This is my old house," Mrs. Vance said as they walked around the structure. "My grandfather built it almost 100 years ago, but it's been abandoned for decades. Nobody wants it. They say it's haunted." Sarah observed the house with curiosity rather than fear. She didn't believe in ghosts, but she did notice something strange. The tilt wasn't uniform. It was as if something very heavy was pulling the house to one specific side. "Why is it so crooked, ma'am?" Mrs. Vance looked at her with those piercing grey eyes, and for a moment, Sarah thought she was going to get an answer. But the millionaire only smiled again with that mysterious, tired smile. "That, my dear Sarah, is a secret only I know." They returned to the estate in silence, but Sarah couldn't stop thinking about that crooked house and Mrs. Vance's words. There was something hidden there, something important, and without knowing why, she felt that this secret was about to change her life forever. The answer would come much sooner than she imagined, and in a way she never could have predicted, because 3 days later, on a Tuesday afternoon, Mrs. Vance's son would arrive from Toronto with his wife and young son, and that 5-year-old child, mischievous and curious, would get too close to the edge of the artificial pond in the estate gardens. And when he fell into the water, screaming and flailing his arms desperately, it would be Sarah who was nearby. It would be Sarah who would have to make the most important decision of her life in a split second. Tuesday dawned with a suffocating heat that foretold a storm. Sarah arrived at the estate at 6 a.m. as always, but found the house in an unusual state of agitation. Mrs. Vance was in the kitchen, giving orders to the other employee, a young woman named Maria, who helped with food preparation. "My son is coming today from Toronto," Mrs. Vance announced without looking up from the list she was writing. "He's bringing his wife Chelsea and my grandson Jack. I want everything to be impeccable. The master bedroom on the second floor must shine. Fresh sheets, clean towels, fresh flowers in the bathroom." Sarah nodded and immediately got to work. She had heard talk of Mrs. Vance's son, James Vance, but had never met him. According to Maria, he was a successful engineer who almost never visited his mother, too busy with his business and city life. Mrs. Vance gets nervous when he comes, Maria confided to her while they prepared the room. "I think it hurts her that her son visits so little. He only comes out of obligation, you know?" Not like us, who are here every day. Sarah didn't respond, but she kept that information in her heart. She knew that kind of pain, that of loving someone who doesn't reciprocate with the same intensity. James and his family arrived around 3 p.m. in a black BMW SUV that raised a cloud of dust as it drove up the gravel driveway. Sarah saw them from the second-floor window. A man of about 35, tall and handsome, dressed in expensive but casual clothes. His wife, a slender woman with dyed blonde hair and huge sunglasses, and the child Jack, a small, 5-year-old, with dark, curly hair who jumped out of the car before it had fully stopped. "Jack, stop!" Chelsea shrieked in a high, annoyed voice. "You're going to hurt yourself." But the child was already running towards the house, laughing and shouting as if the whole world were his playground. Mrs. Vance came out to greet them with a tense smile. Sarah went downstairs discreetly so as not to get in the way, but Mrs. Vance called out, "Sarah, come, I want you to meet my family." Sarah approached with her hands clasped in front of her apron, feeling the evaluative gazes of James and Chelsea upon her. "This is Sarah Davies, Mrs. Vance said with a tone that Sarah thought was almost proud. "She's been working with me for 2 months. She's an exceptional woman. Nice to meet you," Sarah murmured with a slight bow of her head. James returned the greeting politely, but Chelsea barely looked at her before turning to her mother-in-law. "Mom Eleanor, it's unbearably hot. Don't you have air conditioning in this house? The air conditioning is in the rooms." "Mrs. Vance replied with forced patience, "Sarah will show you where you can cool off." As she carried the visitors' luggage upstairs, Sarah heard Jack running everywhere, touching everything, shouting questions that no one answered. The child had that wild energy of youngsters who have never known limits. The rest of the afternoon passed in a tense atmosphere. During the roast dinner that Sarah served in the main dining room, James and Chelsea barely spoke to Mrs. Vance. Conversations were superficial, full of awkward pauses. Jack wouldn't sit still for a minute, constantly getting up to run around the table or tug on the tablecloth. "Jack, sit down," Chelsea said without conviction, without even looking at him. Mrs. Vance watched her grandson with a mixture of love and sadness. Sarah noticed it as she cleared the plates. The millionaire extended her hand towards the child as he passed near her, but Jack dodged it and kept running. The pain in Mrs. Vance's eyes was like a dagger for Sarah. After dinner, James and Chelsea retired to their room, citing travel fatigue. Jack, however, was still full of energy. Mrs. Vance suggested he go play in the garden where there was more space. The child ran out without waiting for a reply. "Sarah, Mrs. Vance called when she finished washing the dishes. Go outside and watch the boy. I don't trust his parents to be attentive." Sarah went into the garden with a knot in her stomach. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky orange and purple. Jack ran among the trees, chasing imaginary butterflies and shouting at the top of his lungs. Sarah followed him at a safe distance, ready to intervene if necessary. The estate garden was huge, with perfectly manicured lawn areas, old rose bushes, and at the back, near the property line, an artificial pond that Mrs. Vance's grandfather had built decades ago. The pond was about 20 meters in diameter and surrounded by weeping willows. The water looked dark and deep under the twilight light. Jack ran towards the pond as if drawn by a magnet. Sarah quickened her pace. "Jack, don't get too close to the water," she called in a firm but gentle voice. The child looked at her over his shoulder and smiled with that mischievous grin all children have when they know they're about to do something forbidden. Then he kept running closer and closer to the edge. "Jack, stop!" Sarah insisted, now with urgency in her voice. But the child crouched by the water, fascinated by something floating on the surface. Sarah was 5 meters away when she saw what was going to happen a fraction of a second before it did. Jack leaned too far, lost his balance. His arms flailed in the air, looking for something to hold on to, and then he fell into the water with a splash that echoed in the twilight silence like a gunshot. Sarah didn't think, didn't calculate, didn't hesitate for an instant. She plunged into the pond, clothes and shoes, and the weight of the world on her shoulders. The water was icy cold and deeper than it looked. She sank to the bottom, feeling the cold mud under her feet before pushing herself upward. Her eyes burned from the murky water. But she managed to see Jack's small figure sinking, his little arms flailing weakly, his mouth open in a silent scream. Sarah swam towards him with all the strength she had left in her body. She grabbed the child by the waist, just as he was about to give up, pulled him to her chest, and kicked with her legs, fighting against the weight of the water that drenched her clothes and pulled her down. Every movement was an agony. Her lungs screamed for air, her muscles trembled with exhaustion, but she didn't give up. She surfaced with Jack in her arms, coughing and spitting water. The child cried in terror, clinging to her with surprising strength for someone so small. Sarah swam to the shore, each stroke more difficult than the last, until finally her hands touched the grass. She crawled out of the pond with the child still clinging to her chest, trembling violently, soaked to the bone. Jack coughed and cried, but he was alive. He was breathing. Sarah laid him on the grass and checked his mouth to make sure he hadn't swallowed water. The child looked at her with huge eyes, full of tears and fear. "It's over," Sarah whispered, stroking his wet hair. "You're safe now. It's all over." The shouts came a moment later. Mrs. Vance ran from the house with a speed Sarah wouldn't have believed possible in a woman her age. Behind her came James and Chelsea, their faces distorted by panic. "Jack!" Chelsea shrieked, falling to her knees beside her son and snatching him from Sarah's arms. My baby, my baby." James also knelt, checking his son with trembling hands. Mrs. Vance, however, looked directly at Sarah. Her grey eyes were filled with tears. "You saved him," the millionaire whispered. "You saved him." Sarah couldn't answer. Suddenly, all the adrenaline that had sustained her evaporated, and she began to tremble uncontrollably. Mrs. Vance wrapped her in her own shawl and helped her up. "Maria!" Mrs. Vance shouted towards the house. "Bring blankets and hot water, quickly!" That night, after Jack was taken to the hospital as a precaution and returned with a clean bill of health, after Sarah changed her clothes and drank hot tea until she stopped trembling, Mrs. Vance called her to her study. The millionaire was sitting behind her mahogany desk with her hands clasped and her gaze lost somewhere on the wall. When Sarah entered, Mrs. Vance looked up. Her eyes were red as if she had been crying. "Sit down," she said softly. Sarah obeyed, feeling strangely nervous. Mrs. Vance took a deep breath, as if gathering courage for something very difficult. "Sarah, you risked your life for my grandson, a child you didn't even know, Eugenia, without thinking, without asking for anything in return. And that," her voice broke, "that is something I will never be able to forget, much less repay." "You don't have to repay me anything, ma'am," Sarah replied honestly. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Mrs. Vance said firmly, "not anyone. Most people would have screamed for help. They would have hesitated. You didn't hesitate for a second." She stood up and walked to the window. "For months I have observed you, Sarah. I have seen how you work without complaining, how you endure the town gossips with your head held high, how you love your children with every fiber of your being. And today you confirmed what I already knew. You are an extraordinary woman." Sarah felt tears threatening to overflow, but she held them back. Mrs. Vance returned to the desk and took a folder from one of the drawers. She opened it and pulled out several documents. "Do you remember the crooked house I showed you 2 weeks ago?" Sarah nodded, confused. "That house is yours. I'm giving it to you now as a token of my gratitude. The deeds are here. Tomorrow we will go to Mr. Henderson, the lawyer, to make the official transfer." Sarah was speechless. The crooked house, that tilted, old, abandoned structure. It wasn't much, but it was infinitely more than she had. "Ma'am, I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything," Mrs. Vance interrupted with a smile. "Just accept it. It's yours, and what's inside also." Those last words hung in the air like an untold secret. Sarah opened her mouth to ask what they meant, but Mrs. Vance had already put away the documents and was walking towards the door. "Now go home to your children," the millionaire said. "Tomorrow we'll discuss the details." And Sarah stopped at the threshold and looked at her one last time. "Thank you. Thank you for saving the only thing in this world that truly still matters to me." Sarah returned to her small rented house that night, walking as if in a dream. A house. Mrs. Vance had given her a crooked, old, abandoned house, but a house at last, a place of her own. The first step towards a better life for her and her children. But there was something in Mrs. Vance's words that kept resonating in her mind. And what's inside also? What was inside that crooked house? What secret did it hide that made it lean in such a strange way? And why had Mrs. Vance smiled with that mixture of sadness and relief when she told her it was all hers? The answers were there, waiting for her in that tilted house. And when she finally discovered them, Sarah would understand that saving Jack had not just been an act of heroism. It had been the key that would open the door to a destiny that would change her life and that of her 6 children forever. But before that, before the move and the discovery, she would have to face something she didn't expect. The fury of Mrs. Vance's nephew and niece, Robert and Victoria, who had just found out that their aunt had given away one of her properties to a simple housekeeper, and they were not going to let that stand. The news spread through Willowbrook like wildfire in a dry season. Sarah Davies, the poor widow who cleaned other people's floors, now owned a property. The town's poisonous tongues worked tirelessly. In the market, in the square, at the church doors, the gossip grew and distorted with each repetition. They say she seduced the millionaire's son, Mrs. Jenkins, whispered to a group of neighbors. That's why she got the house. She must be having an affair with him. No, I heard the child fell into the pond on purpose, another added. It was all a plan to extract money from Mrs. Vance. Sarah heard the rumors when she went to buy groceries or when she picked up her children from school, and each word was like a slap, but it didn't matter as much as before. She had something more important to focus on. Her 6 children would finally have a roof over their heads, even if that roof was crooked. On Wednesday morning, Mrs. Vance arrived to pick her up in her SUV. Sarah got in nervously, her stomach in knots. They were going to the office of Mr. Henderson, the lawyer, a serious man with thick glasses and a grey mustache, who had handled the Vance family's legal affairs for over 30 years. As Mrs. Vance drove through the cobblestone streets of downtown, Sarah noticed a black car following them at a distance. It was a dark Mercedes with tinted windows. Something about that vehicle sent a shiver of warning down her spine. The lawyer's office was in an old heritage building with wrought iron balconies and carved wooden doors. When they entered the main office, Sarah was surprised to find 2 other people waiting, Robert and Victoria Vance, Mrs. Vance's nephew and niece. Robert was a man of about 40 with slicked back hair and an expensive suit that couldn't hide his calculating gaze. Victoria, his younger sister, was 35 and had a face that would have been beautiful, were it not for the bitter expression that seemed permanent on her dark red lips. "Aunt Eleanor," Robert said in a honeyed voice that didn't match the ice in his eyes. "What a surprise to find you here. We didn't know you had an appointment with the lawyer. I didn't have to inform you," Mrs. Vance replied dryly. "My affairs don't concern you." "But Aunt," Victoria interjected with false sweetness. "We're family. Everything you do concerns us, especially when it comes to giving away family properties to strangers." Her eyes fixed on Sarah with a disdain so pure it was almost tangible. Sarah felt the ground open beneath her. How had they found out so quickly? "Sarah is not a stranger," Mrs. Vance said, lifting her chin with dignity. "She saved my granddaughter, something none of you would have done. That doesn't give her the right to receive properties that have belonged to our family for generations." Robert snapped, dropping his mask of courtesy. "That house was your grandfather's, our great-grandfather's. You can't just give it away to an employee." Mr. Henderson cleared his throat uncomfortably from his desk. "Mrs. Vance has every legal right to dispose of her properties, as she sees fit," he said in a professional voice. "The house in question has been in her name for over 20 years. There is no legal impediment to making the transfer." "But there is a moral impediment," Victoria insisted. "Aunt, that house is part of our family heritage. You can't do this. Dad and Mom would turn over in their graves if they knew." "As for your father," Mrs. Vance replied, her voice cutting like glass, "he was my younger brother and a greedy man who borrowed money all his life without repaying a single cent. So don't tell me he'd be concerned about family heritage." The silence that followed was so dense that Sarah could almost feel it pressing against her skin. She wanted to disappear, to become invisible, not to be there in the middle of that family quarrel. But Mrs. Vance took her hand and squeezed it firmly. "Mr. Henderson," the millionaire said without taking her eyes off her nephew and niece, "proceed with the transfer now." The next 30 minutes were torture. Sarah signed where she was told, her hands trembling, her heart beating so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. Robert and Victoria remained seated in a corner, shooting her looks of pure hatred that promised revenge. When the process was finished, and the lawyer handed her the deeds in a manila envelope, Sarah felt her legs could barely support her. Mrs. Vance guided her towards the exit, completely ignoring her nephew and niece. But just as they reached the door, Robert spoke in a low voice, full of threat. "This isn't over, Aunt. We're going to challenge this transfer. And as for you," his eyes fixed on Sarah, "enjoy your little crooked house while you can. It won't be yours for long." In the SUV on the way back to the estate, Mrs. Vance drove in silence for a long time. Finally, when they were leaving town, she spoke. "Don't listen to them. They have no legal power to take that house from you. The deeds are in your name. It's yours, Sarah, yours, and your children's." But Sarah didn't feel at ease. She knew men like Robert. She knew that kind of hatred, and she knew he wouldn't stop just because the law wasn't on his side. That afternoon after work, Sarah gathered her 6 children in her small rented house and gave them the news. Liam, the oldest, looked at her with a mixture of joy and disbelief. "A house, Mom? Really?" "Really, my love. It's old and a little crooked, but it's ours. We finally have a place of our own." The twins, Ethan and Noah, shouted with excitement. Emily and Chloe hugged their mother, crying with happiness. Only little Leo, too, didn't quite understand what was happening, but he smiled because everyone else was smiling. They spent the next 3 days preparing for the move. They didn't have much to pack. Clothes, a few pots, the children's worn toys, school notebooks, but each object felt lighter now that they knew they were taking it to a home of their own. Early Saturday morning, they arrived at the crooked house with the help of a neighbor who had a pickup truck. The children ran out of the vehicle and stood in front of the property, mouths agape. The house was even stranger than Sarah remembered. The entire structure leaned to the east, as if something incredibly heavy was pulling from that side. The red shingle roof was partially sunken. The weathered timber and stone walls showed deep cracks. The wooden windows were swollen with dampness. The front porch curved at an impossible angle. Around the house, the ground was covered in tall weeds and wild trees that hadn't been pruned in decades. "Mom," Emily whispered, taking Sarah's hand. "Are we really going to live here?" "Yes, my love, and we're going to fix it up little by little. You'll see, it will be beautiful." But inside, Sarah felt a pang of doubt. How was this place going to be habitable? She had no money for repairs, barely enough to eat. She opened the front door, which creaked with a sound that seemed like a lament, and they all entered together. The interior was dark and smelled of old dampness. The wooden floor was covered in dust and dry leaves that had blown in through the broken windows. In the living room were old pieces of furniture covered with white sheets that looked like ghosts in the gloom. But what most caught Sarah's attention was the strange layout of the house. There was a large living room, a small kitchen with a wood stove, 2 bedrooms to the left, a tiny bathroom, and a locked door at the end of a short hallway on the east side of the house. The door was made of thick wood, with an old, rusty padlock hanging from an iron ring. Sarah approached the door and touched it with the palm of her hand. The wood was cold, too cold to be normal, and when she put her ear against the surface, she thought she heard something. Not exactly a sound, but rather a presence, as if the room breathed. "Mom, what's in there?" Liam asked, approaching curiously. "I don't know. It's locked. Can we open it?" Sarah looked at the padlock. It was old but sturdy. They would need tools to open it, or the key. "Tomorrow I'll find a way to open it," she promised. "Now help me clean. We have a lot of work to do." They spent the whole day sweeping, mopping, taking the sheets off the old furniture, opening windows to let in fresh air. The children worked with surprising energy, singing and laughing despite their tiredness. For them, this was an adventure, a new beginning. When the sun began to set, Sarah made a simple supper with the provisions she had brought: soup, sandwiches, and a bit of cheese. They ate sitting on the living room floor as if it were a picnic. And for the first time, in a long time, Sarah felt something akin to peace. That night, she put the children to bed in the 2 rooms, sharing old mattresses they had found in a closet. Sarah stayed awake a little longer, sitting on the crooked porch, looking at the stars that shone over the wild land. She thought of David, her dead husband, who had worked until the last day of his life without complaining. She thought of the humiliations she had endured in Willowbrook. She thought of the nights her children had gone to bed hungry. She thought of all the times she had begged God to give her a chance, just one, to give her children a better life. And God had answered, but not as she expected, not with a better job or a stroke of luck, but through Mrs. Vance, a lonely woman who had seen something in Sarah that no one else had seen: dignity, kindness, courage. She got up and walked back towards the locked door. The full moon shone through the broken windows, creating strange shadows on the tilted walls. Sarah touched the padlock with her fingers and felt that unnatural cold again. "What are you hiding?" she whispered to the door. "What weighs so much that it makes the whole house lean towards you?" There was no answer, of course, just the silence of the night and the distant sound of crickets. But when she returned to the living room to sleep on the old sofa, Sarah noticed something she hadn't seen before. On the frame of the locked door, almost invisible in the gloom, was a small inscription carved into the wood. She approached with a candle she had lit and read the words, "Worn by time. What you protect with your life will protect you." A shiver ran down her spine. Who had carved that? Mrs. Vance's grandfather? And what did it mean? Sarah was about to turn away when she heard something that left her paralyzed. A sound coming from inside the locked room. It wasn't loud, it wasn't threatening, it was just a slight creak, like old wood settling, or like something very heavy, shifting barely a millimeter. And then, in the silence that followed, Sarah would have sworn she heard something else, something that sounded impossibly like a deep, slow, patient breathing, as if whatever was in that room had been waiting for years, decades, waiting for someone to arrive, waiting for the right person to finally open the door and discover what Mrs. Vance had kept hidden from the world for so long, what had made that house lean under the weight of the greatest secret of her life. Sunday dawned with a disturbing silence. The rain had stopped during the night, leaving the ground soaked and the air heavy with humidity. Sarah woke up early on the old sofa, her body aching and her mind restless. The sounds of the previous night had kept her from sleeping well. Every creak of the house, every groan of the old wood, made her think of that locked room and what might be hidden behind that door. She made coffee on the wood stove and went out to the porch to drink it, while the children were still asleep. The land looked different under the grey morning light, wilder, more abandoned. The trees surrounding the property were enormous and twisted, with branches extending like arthritic fingers towards the sky. The weeds reached the house windows. In the distance, she could see the gravel road that connected the property to the main highway. She was taking the last sip of coffee when she saw the car, the same black Mercedes that had followed them to the lawyer's office. It stopped on the road about 50 meters from the house, but didn't turn off the engine. The tinted windows made it impossible to see who was inside, but Sarah knew with absolute certainty that it was Robert Vance. The car remained there for 5 eternal minutes, just observing, just waiting. Then, as silently as it had arrived, it turned around and drove away, raising a cloud of reddish dust. Sarah felt a knot of fear in her stomach. That man wasn't going to give up, and she was alone here with 6 children in a house that barely stood. When the children woke up, Sarah kept them busy with cleaning tasks and minor repairs. Liam helped repair a broken window using cardboard and duct tape. The twins pulled more weeds from the garden. Emily and Chloe swept the porch. Even little Leo helped by picking up twigs and putting them in a bucket. But Sarah's mind was elsewhere. It was in that locked room, in the rusty padlock, in the inscription carved on the frame, in the sounds she had heard during the night. What you protect with your life will protect you. What did that mean? What was in there that needed protection or could protect her? Near noon, when the rain finally began to fall, an unexpected visitor arrived. A white SUV stopped in front of the house, and Mrs. Vance stepped out, dressed in simple but elegant clothes, carrying a large basket covered with a blanket. "I came to see how you're settling in," the millionaire said as she went up to the porch, dodging the most crooked boards, "and to bring you a few things." The basket contained food, freshly baked bread, cheese, ham, fruits, milk, and even a whole roast chicken. The children crowded around with bright eyes of excitement. Sarah felt tears threatening to overflow. "Ma'am, you didn't have to." "Yes, I did," Mrs. Vance interrupted firmly. "And don't call me ma'am, call me Eleanor. You don't work for me anymore. Now you're a friend." The word hung in the air, strange and new for both of them, but also true. Mrs. Vance entered the house and walked through it with a critical eye. When she reached the hallway leading to the locked door, she stopped. Her face grew serious. "Have you tried to open it?" she asked without taking her eyes off the door. "I don't have the key, and the padlock is very old. I'd need tools to break it." Mrs. Vance reached into her jacket pocket and took out a small key, darkened by time. She held it in front of Sarah, as if she were handing over something sacred. "This is the key," she said softly. "But before you open that door, I need to explain some things to you. Can we talk alone?" Sarah asked Liam to look after his siblings and followed Mrs. Vance to the porch. They sat on the crooked stairs as the rain fell heavily, creating a veil of privacy around them. Mrs. Vance took a deep breath before speaking. "My grandfather, Cornelius Vance, built this house more than 90 years ago. He was a very rich man, but also very cautious. He didn't trust banks. He didn't trust anyone, really. So he decided to store his fortune in a particular way." Sarah listened in silence, her heart beating faster. "For years, my grandfather accumulated valuable objects, antique colonial art, ancient religious sculptures, jewelry from the early 20th century, silver coins from the colonial mines, historical documents, rare books, things that today are worth fortunes. He kept it all in that room, and the weight of so many objects after decades was what caused the house to lean that way." Sarah felt the world stop around her. The sound of the rain became distant. Her voice was barely a whisper when she spoke. "Are you saying that inside that room there is a fortune?" Mrs. Vance completed. "A fortune that my grandfather bequeathed to my grandmother, who then passed it to my father, who then passed it to me. But I never took it out. I never sold it. I left it in that room all these years because I knew that if my family found out the true value of what was inside, They would kill me to get it. But your nephew and niece, Robert and Victoria, they don't know. They know the house exists. They know it's abandoned and crooked, but they believe it's just an old, worthless property. My grandfather was very clever. He never registered the contents of the room in any official inventory. To the world, those things don't exist, and I kept that secret for over 20 years. Sarah felt a sudden dizziness. This couldn't be happening. It couldn't be real. Why? She asked, her voice trembling. Why are you telling me this? Why did you give me the house with everything in it? Mrs. Vance looked at her with those piercing grey eyes, but this time there was tenderness in them and deep sadness, because I have no one else to trust. My husband died 22 years ago. My son lives in Toronto and only visits out of obligation. His cousins only wait for me to die to divide the little they think I have. I am alone, Sarah, completely alone. Her voice broke. But then I saw you work. I saw you endure humiliations with dignity. I saw you love your children with a strength I never had. And when you jumped into the pond without thinking to save my grandson, I knew you were the right person, the only person who deserved this. I can't accept this, Sarah said, standing up abruptly. It's too much. I just did what any decent person would have done. I don't deserve a fortune for that. It's not for that, Mrs. Vance insisted, also standing up. It's for who you are, for how you've lived your life even in the worst adversity, and because I know you will use that fortune for good, for your children, to give them the life they deserve. Sarah wanted to argue, wanted to refuse, but the words wouldn't come because in the depths of her heart she knew that this opportunity was a miracle, being a second chance that life was giving her after so much suffering. Mrs. Vance placed the key in the palm of her hand and closed Sarah's fingers around it. Open the room when you're ready. Take your time. You don't have to decide anything now, but I want you to know that everything in there is legally yours. The deeds to the house explicitly include the contents. It's protected by inheritance laws that no one can touch, not even my nephew and niece, though they will try. And you don't need any of that. Mrs. Vance smiled sadly. I already had my life. I already had my chance. Now it's your turn and your children's. They remained in silence for a long time, listening to the rain, each lost in her thoughts. Finally, Mrs. Vance said goodbye with an embrace that Sarah didn't expect and drove away in her white SUV, disappearing into the curtain of water. Sarah stood on the porch with the key in her hand, trembling, not from cold, but from anticipation mixed with fear. Inside that house, behind that locked door, waited something that could change her life forever, but also something that made her vulnerable. Because if Robert and Victoria found out the true value of what was inside, a thunderclap rumbled in the sky so loud it made the house shake. The children screamed, frightened, from inside. Sarah hurried in to calm them. That night, after a simple supper and putting the children to bed, Sarah stood in front of the locked door with the key in her hand. The house was in absolute silence, except for the constant drumming of the rain on the roof and the occasional creak of the wood. She reached out to the padlock. The key slid into the lock, as if it had been waiting for this moment for decades. It turned with a metallic click that echoed in the hallway like a gunshot. The padlock opened. Sarah removed it with trembling hands and let it fall to the floor. She put her hand on the doorknob. It was icy cold. She took a deep breath once, twice, 3 times. Then she pushed. The door opened slowly with a long, agonizing creak. The darkness inside was absolute. Sarah couldn't see anything beyond the threshold, just darkness and that strange smell, like old paper and antique wood, and something else she couldn't identify. She felt along the wall for a light switch next to the door, but found none. Of course not. This house was very old. It didn't have electricity in that room. She would need candles or an oil lamp, something to illuminate that space that had remained closed for so long. She was about to close the door when she saw something that made her heart stop. In the absolute darkness of the room, something gleamed. It wasn't much, just a faint glint, like light reflecting on a polished surface. But it was there, and it seemed to move slightly, as if breathing. Sarah took a step back, every hair on her body bristling, and then from somewhere in the depths of that dark room, she heard a sound that couldn't be real, a sound that left her completely paralyzed. The delicate jingle of metal against metal, like coins falling or chains moving or something heavy settling into place after being disturbed. And beneath that almost imperceptible sound, something else, a whisper, not of voices, but of the air itself moving inside the room, as if the space had been sealed for so long that the simple act of opening the door had awakened something that slept. Sarah slammed the door shut, her heart pounding so hard her chest hurt. She leaned against the hallway wall, trembling, trying to catch her breath. Tomorrow she would go in with daylight, with candles, with her children awake in the house, so she wouldn't feel so alone. Tomorrow she would face whatever waited in that room. But as she returned to the living room to try to sleep, a part of her knew the truth. After having opened that door, after having disturbed what slept within, nothing would ever be the same. And not just because of the fortune she expected to discover, but because by opening that door she had released something more. Something that Mrs. Vance had kept locked away for decades, a secret so great, so heavy, that it had made an entire house lean under its weight. A secret that Robert and Victoria Vance were about to discover, because at that precise moment, as Sarah tried unsuccessfully to sleep, the black Mercedes was again parked on the gravel road, and Robert was inside, speaking on the phone in a low, urgent voice, giving precise instructions to someone on the other end of the line, instructions that involved that crooked house, and a widow who had no idea of the danger approaching. Monday dawned with a disturbing silence. The rain had ceased during the night, leaving the ground soaked and the air heavy with humidity. Sarah woke up early on the old sofa, her body aching, and her mind still caught in the sounds she had heard behind the locked door. She prepared breakfast for the children, hot oatmeal with a little sugar and cinnamon, the last remaining slices of toast, watery coffee. As they ate, Sarah noticed Liam watching her with concern. "Mom, are you okay? You look tired." "I'm fine, my love. I just slept poorly." But it wasn't just that. All night she had had the feeling that someone was watching the house from outside. Several times she had gotten up to look out the broken windows, but she never saw anything but darkness and the trees moving in the wind. After breakfast, she asked Liam to stay and watch his siblings. She took 3 thick candles she had found in a kitchen drawer, a lighter, and walked towards the hallway with a determined step. She couldn't postpone this any longer. She needed to know what was in that room. She needed to understand why Mrs. Vance had given her something so valuable. The door was exactly as she had left it the night before, closed with the padlock on the floor. Sarah lit the 3 candles, placed 2 on the hallway floor for backup light, and held the third with a steady hand. Then she pushed the door. This time it opened without resistance, as if the room had accepted that it would finally be revealed. The candlelight penetrated the darkness, and what Sarah saw took her breath away. The room was larger than she expected, perhaps 5 by 6 meters, but every inch was occupied. The walls were covered with dark wooden shelves, and on those shelves were everything. Objects carefully stacked, protected with cloths, organized by categories that revealed the orderly mind of Mrs. Vance's grandfather. Sarah took a step forward, raising the candle to see better. Her breathing quickened. On the nearest shelf were framed antique religious paintings, serene saints, Christs carved in ancient wood. Sarah recognized the style, though she didn't know much about art, but even she could see they were old, very old, centuries old. Beyond, in wooden boxes with bronze locks, were books, hundreds of books. Sarah opened a box carefully and pulled out the top volume. It was a huge book with embossed leather covers and pages yellowed by time. The title was in Old English, almost illegible, but she could make out a date, 1683, 342 years old. She continued to advance, her legs trembling. In the center of the room were iron chests with padlocks that were also open, as if Mrs. Vance had wanted Sarah to be able to access everything without difficulty. She knelt in front of the first and opened it. Coins, hundreds, perhaps thousands of silver coins gleamed in the candlelight like tiny stars. Sarah picked one up with trembling fingers. It was heavy, cold. It had a crest engraved on it, and letters she couldn't quite read, but she knew this was pure silver from colonial mines. The second chest contained jewelry, huge pearl necklaces, rings with precious stones that flashed with colors when the candlelight touched them, intricately worked gold bracelets, antique brooches with embedded diamonds. Sarah knew nothing about jewelry, but even she could see that these objects were not simple ornaments. They were historical treasures. The third chest almost made her cry. It was filled with silver bars, perfectly stacked, each the size of a brick. Sarah counted 30 bars. Then she stopped counting because tears blurred her vision. But that wasn't all. There were more shelves at the back of the room. She stood up and walked there, feeling her legs barely support her. She found carved wooden religious sculptures, some so detailed they seemed alive. Gold and silver chalices, manuscripts rolled in leather tubes, hand-drawn antique maps, official documents with red wax seals, indigenous artifacts of jade and obsidian, that Mrs. Vance's grandfather must have collected on his travels. In one corner, wrapped in velvet cloths, were unframed paintings. Sarah carefully unwrapped one and almost dropped the candle. It was a portrait of a 17th century woman dressed in silks and lace, looking at the viewer with piercing eyes. The painting was signed in the lower corner, but Sarah didn't recognize the name. However, the technique, the colors, the way the light seemed to emanate from the woman's face, this was the work of a master. Sarah carefully put the painting down and sat on the wooden floor, unable to remain standing. Around her, in that room that had made the entire house lean under its weight, was a fortune that surpassed anything she could have imagined. It wasn't just money. It was history. It was art. It was the legacy of generations accumulated with patience and vision, and now it was hers and her 6 children's. She didn't know how long she sat there, crying in silence as the candle burned down. She thought of David, her dead husband, who had worked until the last day of his life without complaining. She thought of the humiliations she had endured in Willowbrook. She thought of the nights her children had gone to bed hungry. She thought of all the times she had begged God to give her a chance, just one, to give her children a better life. And God had answered, but not as she expected, not with a better job or a stroke of luck, but through Mrs. Vance, a lonely woman who had seen something in Sarah that no one else had seen. Dignity, kindness, courage. What you protect with your life will protect you. Now she understood the inscription on the doorframe. Mrs. Vance's grandfather had protected this fortune with his life, keeping it hidden from the world, and now that fortune would protect Sarah and her children. It would give them education, health, opportunities. It would give them the future they deserved. But first, she had to protect it, because if Robert and Victoria found out what was in here, the thought was interrupted by a cry from Liam in the living room. "Mom, Mom, come quick!" Sarah jumped up, carefully placed the candle on the floor, and ran to the living room. She found her 6 children huddled by the window, looking out with frightened faces. "What's wrong?" "There's a man outside," Liam whispered. "He's taking pictures of the house." Sarah peered out the broken window and felt her stomach knot. It was Robert Vance. He was standing in the front yard in broad daylight with a professional camera in his hands. He was taking photographs of the house from all angles. The front, the sides, the sunken roof, the broken windows, and worst of all, he wore an elegant suit and a satisfied smile that boded no good. Sarah went out onto the porch, her heart pounding in her throat. Robert stopped taking pictures and looked at her with that smile that was more a threat than a friendly gesture. "Good morning, Sarah. I hope I'm not interrupting. What are you doing here?" "Just documenting the property," he replied in a honeyed voice. "You see, my lawyer advised me to record the current state of this house for the legal file. Understand? Mrs. Vance already gave me the deeds. The house is legally mine. You can't do anything to change that." Robert's smile widened, but his eyes remained cold as ice. "Oh, no, I'm not trying to take your house, Sarah. That would be difficult, but there are other ways to resolve this matter." He put the camera in his bag and approached the porch. "Look at this place. It's about to fall down. No electricity, no running water. The walls have huge cracks. The roof is sunken. Do you really think it's safe to live here with 6 young children?" Sarah felt a chill of warning. "I can fix it little by little." "With what money?" Robert's voice hardened. "You're a poor woman, Sarah, a widow without resources, and this house needs repairs that would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe millions. How are you going to pay for that? That's none of your business." "But it is the business of municipal bylaw enforcement," Robert said with a triumphant smile. "It turns out I have a friend who works there, and coincidentally, yesterday I mentioned to him that a widow with 6 children had moved into a structurally unsafe house. He told me they're coming to do an inspection, probably tomorrow, and when they see the state of this place," he shrugged, "they're going to condemn it. They're going to prohibit you from living here. And then, what are you going to do?" Sarah felt the world collapsing around her. He was right. The house was a disaster, and if bylaw enforcement declared it uninhabitable. "But don't worry," Robert continued with false compassion. "I have a solution. I'll buy the house from you. I'll offer you $50,000. Cash. Today. It's more than this ruin is worth. With that money, you can rent something decent in town while you find work." $50,000. It was a fortune for someone in her situation, but it was nothing. Absolutely nothing compared to what was in the locked room. "It's not for sale," Sarah said with a firm voice, though she was trembling inside. Robert's smile vanished. His face hardened until it seemed carved in stone. "You're going to regret this," he said in a low, menacing voice. "My aunt made a mistake giving you this property, and I'm going to correct that error one way or another." He turned and walked towards his black Mercedes. Before getting in, he turned one last time. "Oh, and by the way, I told some people in Willowbrook about this house and about your good luck. You know how people in town are gossipy, curious. I imagine you'll soon have many visitors, people asking what's so special about this old house that my aunt gave it to you. People speculating, people investigating. The message was clear. Robert was going to spread rumors. He was going to draw attention to this property. And if enough people started asking questions, eventually someone would discover the secret of the locked room." The Mercedes started and drove away, raising dust. Sarah stood on the porch, trembling with fury and fear. Her children came out of the house and huddled around her. "Mom, who was that man?" Emily asked in a scared voice. "No one important, my love. Just a bad man who will soon learn he can't intimidate us." But in her heart, Sarah knew the truth. She was in trouble, serious trouble. Robert was going to use all the resources at his disposal to take this house from her, and she had no money to hire lawyers. She had no political connections. She had nothing except a crooked house full of treasures that she couldn't sell without attracting dangerous questions. She needed help, and there was only one person in the world who could give it to her. "Liam," she called her eldest son, "I need you to stay and watch your brothers and sisters. I'm going out for a while." "Where are you going?" "To see Mrs. Vance. This can't wait." Sarah walked down the gravel road to the main highway, where she managed to flag down a bus that took her to Willowbrook. From there, she took a taxi she couldn't afford to Vance Manor. When she knocked on the service door, Maria opened it. "Sarah, what are you doing here? I thought you no longer. I need to speak with Mrs. Vance. It's urgent." Maria let her in and went to find the millionaire. Sarah waited in the kitchen, her hands clasped and her heart pounding. When Mrs. Vance entered, her face filled with concern. "What happened? Are you well? Are the children well?" "Robert came to the house this morning," Sarah said bluntly. "He took photos. He said he's going to call bylaw enforcement to condemn the property, and he's spreading rumors in town, so people will wonder what's so special about that house." Mrs. Vance closed her eyes and let out a long, tired sigh. "I knew he would do something like that. My nephew never accepts defeat." She opened her eyes and looked at Sarah with determination. "But he doesn't know who he's dealing with. Neither he nor bylaw enforcement can take that house from you if you don't want to sell it. The deeds are legal and unchallengeable, but if they declare it uninhabitable, I won't be able to live there. And then Robert will keep pressuring me until I have no choice but to sell. Not if we fix the house first. I don't have money for repairs, and you've already given me too much. I can't ask you for more." Mrs. Vance took Sarah's hands in hers. "Sarah, did you open the room?" She nodded, tears threatening to overflow. "Did you see what's inside?" "Yes, I saw everything. I can't believe it's real. I can't believe it's mine now." "Then you already know the answer," Mrs. Vance said softly. "Sell one piece, just one, something small that won't attract too much attention. Use that money to fix the house. Make it habitable, and when bylaw enforcement comes to inspect it, they won't have any legal argument to condemn it." Sarah looked at her with wide eyes. "Sell a piece? But how? Where? To whom? I'm going to help you. I know people, discreet collectors, people who pay well, and don't ask awkward questions." Mrs. Vance smiled. "My grandfather wasn't the only one in the family with connections, you know." For the first time all day, Sarah felt a spark of hope. "Go back to your house," Mrs. Vance continued. "Choose a piece from the room, something valuable but not too large. Bring it to me early tomorrow, and let me take care of the rest." Sarah hugged the millionaire tightly, unable to express in words the gratitude she felt. Mrs. Vance returned the hug, and in that moment the two lonely women clung to each other like shipwreck survivors in the middle of a storm. When Sarah returned to the crooked house, it was already late. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange and purple. Her children ran to greet her, relieved that she had returned. She prepared a simple supper and put them to bed early, singing them songs that David used to sing when he was alive. Then, when the whole house was silent, Sarah returned to the locked room with a candle in her hand. She knelt in front of the chests and began to carefully examine their contents, looking for something she could sell without feeling like she was betraying Mrs. Vance's gift. Finally, at the bottom of the second chest, she found a necklace. It was beautiful, but not ostentatious. A thin gold chain with an oval locket containing a miniature portrait of a young woman. The workmanship was exquisite, clearly antique, probably from the early 19th century. Valuable, but not as much as the silver bars or the colonial paintings. Sarah held it to the candlelight, admiring the details of the locket. Then she carefully put it in her pocket. Tomorrow she would begin to change her destiny. But as she closed the room door and walked back to the living room, She didn't see the figure watching the house from the trees across the road. She didn't see the glint of binoculars reflecting the moonlight. She didn't hear the click of a camera taking photographs in the darkness. Robert Vance was not alone in this. He had hired someone who would watch that house day and night. Someone who would report Sarah's every movement, every entry, every exit, every visitor. And when they finally discovered what secret that crooked house concealed, when they finally understood why Mrs. Vance had given it to a simple housekeeper, the true war would just begin. Tuesday dawned with a clear sky that promised intense heat. Sarah woke before dawn, washed as best she could with the cold water from the rusty bathroom tap, and dressed in her most presentable clothes. The antique necklace rested in a small cloth pouch inside her pocket, weighing more by its meaning than by its size. She left Liam in charge of his siblings with strict instructions. Do not open the door to anyone, keep the windows that still had glass closed, and if they saw Robert's black Mercedes, hide in the back room until it left. "Mom, you're scaring me," Liam said with a frown. He was 14, but sometimes he seemed much older, especially since his father's death. "Don't be scared, my love, just be cautious. I'll be back before noon." The journey to Vance Manor felt eternal. Every minute she spent away from her children was an agony, but when she finally arrived and Mrs. Vance opened the door personally, Sarah felt she could breathe again. Come in, I was waiting for you." In Mrs. Vance's private study, Sarah took out the necklace with trembling hands. The millionaire examined it under the window light, turning the locket between her fingers with expert care. "It's beautiful. Late 1800s, I'd say, probably from Europe, brought to Canada during the Victorian era." She looked up at Sarah. "You chose well. This is valuable, but not so rare as to attract too much attention. Ma'am, how much do you think it's worth? In the open market, with authenticity certificates and provenance, it could be worth between $200,000 and $300,000, but we're not going to the open market." Mrs. Vance rewrapped the necklace in the cloth. "I have a friend in Calgary, Mr. Edward Sinclair. He's a very discreet private collector. I've sold him things before. He doesn't ask questions and pays in cash. He can give us $150,000 for this." Today, Sarah could barely believe what was happening. It was too easy, too fast. "You don't need papers, documents." Edward smiled kindly. "My dear, in my line of work, provenance is sometimes best, not investigated too closely. I trust Eleanor's judgment. If she says this is legitimate, it's enough for me." 20 minutes later, Sarah left that office with a manila envelope full of $50 and $100 bills. $150,000, a weight that was physical but also symbolic, the weight of hope. On the way back, Mrs. Vance gave her practical advice. "Look for Mr. Arthur Campbell. He's the best master builder in Willowbrook. Tell him I sent you. He can fix your house in 2 weeks if you work fast. Use $80,000 for the repairs. Keep the rest for emergencies and for your children. And if Robert tries to stop the work, he can't. It's your property. But work fast, Sarah. Very fast." When Sarah arrived back at the crooked house, it was almost 3 p.m. Her children ran to greet her, and she hugged them with a force that made them shout with laughter. Then she showed them the envelope with the money, without telling them exactly how much there was, and explained that they were going to fix the house. "Really, Mom?" Emily asked with bright eyes. "Will it have electricity and hot water?" "Yes, my love. Everything we need." That afternoon, Sarah walked to town and found Mr. Arthur Campbell in his workshop, a man of about 50 with huge hands and a sun-weathered face. When she mentioned Mrs. Vance's name, Mr. Campbell straightened with respect. "If Mrs. Vance sends me, then I work for you. When do we start?" "Tomorrow. And I need you to work fast, very fast." Mr. Campbell arrived Wednesday at dawn with a crew of 5 men. They started immediately. They reinforced the main roof beams, repaired the cracks in the walls with new mortar, changed the broken windows, installed electricity with the help of a local electrician, connected the water pipes, sanded and varnished the wooden floor. The house transformed into a hive of activity. The children helped by carrying tools and sweeping sawdust. Sarah cooked hearty meals for the workers and supervised every detail. And Mr. Campbell, keeping his word, worked from sunrise to sunset without rest. But on Thursday afternoon, when Sarah went to town to buy more provisions, she heard murmurs. The market gossips were talking about her. They say she found money hidden in that house. "No, I heard Mrs. Vance is secretly giving her more money. And if there's something valuable there, why else would she give her a house?" Sarah clenched her teeth and kept walking. The rumors Robert had planted were growing like weeds, but she couldn't do anything about it. except finish the repairs as quickly as possible. On Friday, the news Sarah had been dreading arrived. Mr. Campbell called her while she was in the kitchen preparing lunch. "Mrs. Davies, there are some men outside. They say they're from bylaw enforcement." Sarah's heart gave a painful lurch. She went out to the porch and saw a white truck parked on the road. Two men dressed in blue shirts and carrying clipboards got out of the vehicle, and behind them, in his black Mercedes, was Robert Vance with a satisfied smile. "Good morning," said one of the inspectors, a burly man of about 40. "I'm Inspector Miller from Municipal Bylaw Enforcement. We received a report that this structure is unsafe. We're here to do an inspection." "Come in," Sarah said with a firm voice, though she was trembling inside. "As you can see, we're making repairs." Mr. Campbell approached with his rolled-up blueprints under his arm. "Inspector Miller, I'm Arthur Campbell, a certified master builder. Here are the plans for the structural repairs we're carrying out. All up to code, all safe." The inspector reviewed the plans with a frown. His colleague walked around the property, taking photographs, measuring cracks, checking beams. Robert watched from his car with his arms crossed and a tense expression. The inspection lasted over 2 hours. Sarah waited with her stomach in knots, while the inspectors checked every corner of the house. When they finally finished, Inspector Miller approached with a serious face. "Mrs. Davies, this house was in very precarious condition. Some of the main beams were rotten. The roof was at risk of collapse. The electrical installations were non-existent and dangerous." Sarah felt the world crashing down around her, but the inspector continued. "However, the repairs you are performing are adequate and professional. If Mr. Campbell continues with the work as planned, in 1 week this structure will be completely habitable and safe." He signed his clipboard. "There is no eviction order. You can continue living here while the works are completed. We just ask you to be careful with the children around the construction areas." Sarah had to lean against the wall not to fall. Mr. Campbell smiled discreetly. The other workers let out sighs of relief. Robert got out of his car, his face red with fury. "How is this possible? This house is a public danger." "Mr. Vance," Inspector Miller said in a professional but cold tone, "the technical inspection does not support your claims. This property is being adequately repaired. There is no legal reason to condemn it." "But you don't understand. This woman has no right to be here. My aunt made a mistake in property. Matters are not the competence of bylaw enforcement," the inspector interrupted. "If you have legal issues with the owner, resolve them in court. Good day." The inspectors left in their truck. Robert stood by his Mercedes, trembling with rage. He looked at Sarah with pure hatred. "Where did you get the money?" he asked in a low, dangerous voice. "Where did you get the money to pay for all this?" "That's none of your business," Sarah replied, finding courage she didn't know she had. "My aunt gave you more than the house, didn't she?" Robert took a step towards her. "There's something else. Something hidden here. That's why the house is crooked. That's why she gave it to you. There's something valuable. Get off my property," Sarah said in a firm voice. "Now!" Robert stared at her for a long time, then smiled. But it wasn't a joyful smile. It was the smile of someone who had just made a dangerous decision. "This isn't over," he whispered. "If my aunt gave you something more than this house, I'm going to find out. And when I do," he didn't finish the sentence, simply got into his car and sped away. Mr. Campbell approached Sarah and placed a large, comforting hand on her shoulder. "That man is dangerous, ma'am. Be careful." The following days passed in a whirlwind of work. Mr. Campbell and his crew worked from dawn till dusk. The house transformed before Sarah's eyes. The walls were reinforced and painted a warm white. The roof was completely repaired with new shingles. The windows now had gleaming glass and solid wooden frames. Electricity illuminated every corner. Hot water ran through the new pipes. But the most impressive thing was the tilt. Mr. Campbell had installed structural supports that made the house appear less crooked, although it obviously could never be perfectly straight without a total reconstruction. Still, it was safe, it was habitable, it was a home. On Sunday, when the works were almost finished, Mrs. Vance came to visit them. She walked through the house with tears in her eyes. "My grandfather would be proud," she whispered. "You have brought this place back to life." That night, after Mrs. Vance left, Sarah put her children to bed in their newly painted rooms with new beds she had bought with some of the remaining money. The children fell asleep, smiling, exhausted but happy. Sarah sat on the porch, now repaired and stable, looking at the stars. For the first time, in a long time, she felt peace. They had succeeded. Against all odds, against Robert's threats, against the town rumors, they had turned this crooked house into a home. But the peace was short-lived. At 3 a.m., Sarah woke to a strange sound, a creak. But it wasn't the normal creak of an old house settling. It was the creak of someone walking carefully, trying not to make noise. She got up without turning on the lights and walked barefoot to the living room. The moonlight entered through the new windows, creating elongated shadows on the floor. Everything seemed normal. Maybe it had just been her imagination. Then she heard another sound. This one came from outside, from the east side of the house, from the side where the locked room was. Sarah ran to the nearest window and looked out. What she saw made her blood run cold. There was a man outside, dressed completely in black, with a small flashlight. He was examining the exterior wall of the locked room, touching it with his hands, measuring something with a tape measure. And next to him, in the darkness, was Robert Vance. They were looking for something. They were trying to understand why that side of the house leaned so much. They were about to discover the secret of the room. And Sarah, alone in the darkness of her house, with her 6 children asleep and defenseless, knew that the true war had just begun. Because if Robert discovered what was in that room, if he understood the true value of what his aunt had given her, he would stop at nothing to take it from her. Absolutely nothing. Sarah watched from the dark window as Robert and the man in black examined the exterior wall of the room. Their hands moved over the old timber and stone, looking for signs, measuring the depth of the tilt. The man took out something that looked like a portable metal detector and slowly passed it over the wall. The device emitted a constant beep. Robert smiled in the darkness. It was the smile of a predator who had just found its prey. Sarah retreated from the window, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to do something. But what? If she went out to confront them, they could become violent. If she called the police, by the time they arrived, they would be gone. And worst of all, Robert knew now. Perhaps he didn't understand exactly what was in the room, but he knew there was something metallic, something heavy, something valuable. She ran to the phone that had been installed with the new electrical line and dialed the number for Vance Manor. It rang 4 times. 5, 6. Finally, Mrs. Vance's sleepy voice answered. "Hello? Mrs. Vance, it's Sarah. Robert is here. He's outside the house with someone. They have a metal detector. They're investigating the room. They know there's something." The silence on the other end of the line lasted only a second, but it felt like an eternity. "Don't go out. Lock all the doors. I'm coming right now, and I'm bringing help." The line went dead. Sarah hung up the phone with trembling hands and ran to check that all the doors were locked. Then she went to her children's rooms. Liam was awake, sitting up in bed with frightened eyes. "Mom, I heard noises outside." "I know, my love. Stay here with your brothers and sisters. Don't go out for anything. Understood?" Liam nodded, but Sarah saw the fear in his eyes. He was still so young, too young to have to live with this kind of threat. She returned to the living room just as she heard a knock on the front door. Loud, authoritative, anything but friendly. "Sarah, open the door. I know you're awake." It was Robert's voice, but there was something different about it. Now there was no pretense of courtesy. No more masks, just pure rage and greed. "Get off my property or I'll call the police," Sarah shouted from the other side of the door. "Go ahead, call them. By the time they arrive, I'll have found what I'm looking for." Sarah heard footsteps moving away from the front door. She ran to the window and saw with horror as Robert and the man in black headed towards the back of the house. Towards the locked room, Robert was carrying something that looked like a heavy sledgehammer. They were going to break down the wall. Sarah ran to the hallway that led to the room. She pressed her back against the locked door as if her body could stop what was coming. She heard the first blow of the sledgehammer against the exterior timber, then the second, then the third. Each impact made the whole house shake. "Stop!" she cried with all the strength in her lungs. "This is my property. What you're doing is illegal." But the blows continued. The old timber began to give way. Sarah could hear the pieces falling to the ground outside. They were about to open a hole in the wall, about to see what was inside. Then, as if in answer to a desperate prayer, she heard the sound of vehicles rapidly approaching along the gravel road. Many vehicles. She ran to the front window and saw 3 trucks entering the property with their lights on. The first was Mrs. Vance's white SUV. The other 2 were municipal police cruisers from Willowbrook. Mrs. Vance got out of her vehicle, followed by 4 uniformed officers and a man in a suit whom Sarah recognized, Chief Inspector Thompson, the head of the municipal police. The blows on the back wall stopped abruptly. Sarah ran out of the house and found Robert and the man in black standing next to a soccer ball-sized hole in the timber wall. Robert still had the sledgehammer in his hands. His face was pale under the police flashlights. "Officer, arrest these men," Sarah cried, pointing at them with a trembling finger. "They're destroying my property." Chief Inspector Thompson approached with a stern expression. He looked at the hole in the wall, then at Robert, then at the man in black who was trying to retreat into the shadows. "Robert Vance," the chief inspector said in a voice that brooked no argument. "You are under arrest for damage to private property and trespassing. You have the right to wait." Robert interrupted, his voice desperate. "You don't understand. This woman has something that belongs to my family. My aunt gave it to her illegally. There's a fortune hidden in that house." "A fortune?" Chief Inspector Thompson asked, skeptically. "What kind of fortune?" Robert pointed towards the hole in the wall. "In there. The metal detector confirmed it. There's gold, silver, valuable objects. My grandfather hid them there decades ago. And now this woman, what's in that house?" Mrs. Vance's firm voice interrupted, approaching the group. "Is legally the property of Sarah Davies. The deeds we signed explicitly include the complete contents of the property. Anything inside that house is hers by legal right. But aunt, that was the family inheritance. You can't just give it to a stranger. I can do whatever I want with my properties, Robert. And I did." Mrs. Vance turned to the chief inspector. "I have certified copies of the deeds here. Everything was done legally before a lawyer. This woman saved my grandson's life. I gave her the house and all its contents as a token of gratitude. My nephew has no legal right to any of this." The chief inspector reviewed the documents Mrs. Vance handed him. Then he looked at Robert with disgust. "Mr. Vance, the documents are in order. You have no rights to this property or its contents. What you did tonight constitutes a serious crime." He signaled to his officers. "Arrest him." "No, wait," Robert shouted as the officers approached. "I can pay you." "I can, but the handcuffs were already on his wrists." The man in black was also arrested. They led them towards the cruisers as Robert shouted threats and curses that were lost in the night. When the cruisers drove away with their prisoners, only silence remained. Sarah collapsed onto the damp grass, trembling from head to toe. Everything had happened so fast. Everything had been so close to disaster. Mrs. Vance knelt beside her and hugged her tightly. "It's over. It's finished. You're safe. And if he comes back? And if he hires more people? What if he won't come back?" Mrs. Vance said with absolute certainty. "Chief Inspector Thompson owes me several favors. Robert is going to spend at least a month in jail for this, and when he gets out, he'll have a restraining order preventing him from approaching this property within 500 meters. Besides, a small smile appeared on her tired face. "I'm going to talk to my lawyer tomorrow. I'm going to change my will. Everything I have, my entire fortune, will go to charitable organizations when I die. Robert and Victoria won't receive a single cent. When they find out, they'll be too busy fighting my will to bother you." Sarah looked at the millionaire with tears streaming down her cheeks. "Why are you doing all this for me?" "Because you are the daughter I never had. Because I saw in you something I had long lost. Genuine kindness in a world full of greed." Mrs. Vance wiped her tears with her handkerchief. "And because my grandfather Cornelius would have wanted his fortune to go to someone who would use it for good. Someone like you." The following days were a transition. Mr. Campbell finished the repairs to the house, including the hole Robert had made in the wall of the room. The crooked house, now reinforced and beautiful, became the envy of the neighborhood. Sarah, with Mrs. Vance's advice, began to sell pieces of the treasure very cautiously. A necklace here, a painting there, always through Edward Sinclair, always with absolute discretion. She never sold enough to attract attention, but just enough to transform her family's life. First, she bought a larger house in Willowbrook, near the best schools. She kept the crooked house as an investment property, renting it to a young family who filled it with laughter and life. The secret room was carefully emptied, and its contents were moved to a safety deposit box in Calgary, where only Sarah and Mrs. Vance had access. Liam began private tutoring with the best teachers and showed an amazing talent for mathematics. The twins, Ethan and Noah, enrolled in a soccer program that discovered their natural abilities as players. Emily started piano lessons and filled the new house with music. Chloe joined a folk dance group and shone in every performance. And little Leo, now 3, attended a preschool where he learned and grew surrounded by other children. Sarah, for the first time in her life, had time to breathe, to think, to dream. She took night classes to finish her high school education, which she had abandoned when she married David. She discovered she loved to read. She discovered she was intelligent, capable, much more than anyone had ever told her. And Mrs. Vance became a constant presence in their lives. She had dinner with them at least twice a week. She attended the twins' soccer games. She listened to Emily play the piano. She read stories to Chloe and Leo. She had become the grandmother the children had never had. 6 months after Robert's arrest, Sarah was in the kitchen of her new house, preparing a roast dinner for a family gathering, when the doorbell rang. She opened the door and found James Vance, Mrs. Vance's son, standing on the threshold with his wife Chelsea and his son Jack. "Sarah," James said humbly, "I know we don't know each other well. I know I haven't been the best son to my mother, but she talks about you all the time, about your children, about how you saved my son." He paused, clearly uncomfortable. "I wanted to thank you personally and apologize for not having done so sooner." Jack, now 6 years old, hid behind his father's legs, shy, but when he saw Sarah, his eyes lit up. "You're the lady who saved me from the pond." Sarah knelt to his height and smiled. "Hello, Jack. How have you been?" "Good. Dad says you're a hero. He says without you I'd be—" The child didn't finish the sentence, but his eyes filled with tears. Sarah hugged him gently. "You're fine. That's all that matters." That night, the dinner was noisy and chaotic, and perfect. Sarah's children and Jack played in the garden. James and Chelsea chatted with Mrs. Vance about moving back to Willowbrook to be closer to her. Sarah watched the scene from the kitchen, her heart so full she thought it would explode. "What are you thinking about?" Mrs. Vance asked, appearing beside her with 2 cups of coffee. "I'm thinking about David," Sarah said honestly. "I wish he were here to see this. To see our children happy, healthy, with a future. To know that everything turned out well in the end." "He knows," Mrs. Vance said softly. "Wherever he is, he knows, and he's proud of you." A year after receiving the crooked house, Sarah was sitting on the porch of her original home one Sunday afternoon. The house had been completely restored, and now the family who rented it cared for it lovingly. Sarah came to visit occasionally, just to remember. Mrs. Vance arrived in her white SUV and sat next to her on the repaired stairs. "Do you know what my grandfather Cornelius told me before he died?" the millionaire asked suddenly. "I was 12 years old. He was in his bed, very sick, but he took my hand and said, 'Eleanor, money is just paper and metal. What matters is what you do with it. Use it to protect those who deserve it, to give opportunities to those with good hearts but bad luck. That is the only way money has true value.'" Mrs. Vance looked at Sarah with tears in her gray eyes. "For decades I didn't understand what he meant. I kept his fortune hidden in this room, afraid it would fall into the wrong hands. But when I saw you jump into that pond without thinking, when I saw your pure heart and your courage, I finally understood what my grandfather meant." She took Sarah's hand in hers. "You are the reason he saved that fortune. You are the person who deserved to find it." Sarah couldn't speak. She just hugged Mrs. Vance and cried tears of gratitude, of relief, of pure happiness. 3 years later, Liam was accepted into the University of Toronto with a full scholarship to study engineering. The twins played in the junior league of a professional soccer team. Emily gave piano concerts in the city. Chloe won a provincial dance competition. And Leo, now 5, read books that 7-year-olds could barely understand. Sarah had finished high school and was studying business administration at the local university. She had opened a small foundation that helped widows in situations similar to what she had experienced. She gave them work, training, emotional support. She had named it the Cornelius Vance Foundation in honor of Mrs. Vance's grandfather. And the crooked house, that tilted structure that once seemed about to collapse, had become a legend in Willowbrook. People told the story of the poor widow who had received a house that seemed worthless but hid a miracle. A house that leaned not from a curse, but from the weight of the love and generosity of a man who had kept his fortune for the right person. A person who was not of his blood, but who had shown to have the heart he always valued. Humble, brave, Gint. 5 years after that night, Sarah had seen her husband die in the carpentry workshop. She stood in front of the crooked house with her 6 children, all elegantly dressed. Mrs. Vance was beside her, now 65, but still strong and dignified. "Mom," Liam said, now 19 and taller than her. "Are you ready?" Sarah looked at the house one last time. The house that had been tilted by the weight of a secret. The house that had given her a second chance. The house that had changed her life, and that of her children forever. "Yes," she said firmly, "I'm ready." Because that afternoon, Sarah Davies was going to do something she had never imagined possible. She was going to Liam's university graduation ceremony. She was going to see her son, the son of the dead carpenter and the poor widow, receive his engineering degree. And then they would go to an elegant restaurant, all 8 of them together, celebrating not only the graduation, but the entire journey they had traveled. A journey that had begun with tragedy, continued with humiliations and poverty, but that had found redemption in the simplest and most profound act, kindness. The kindness of saving a life, without asking for anything in return. The kindness of recognizing that kindness and rewarding it. The kindness that multiplies and expands like ripples in water, touching lives, transforming destinies, creating miracles. As they walked to the new car Sarah had bought with money honestly earned from her work and prudent investments, Leo took her hand. "Mom, is it true that we were once poor?" Sarah knelt beside her youngest son and stroked his hair. "Yes, my love. We were once poor, but we were never miserable because we always had love, and now we have love and also opportunities. But the important thing, what you must never forget, is that love came first." "And the crooked house?" the child asked curiously. "Why was it crooked?" Sarah smiled, looking towards the tilted structure that now gleamed under the afternoon sun. "Because sometimes the most valuable things in life are so heavy, so important, that they make everything around them lean a little. But that doesn't mean they're broken. It just means they're full of history, of love, of secrets that waited to be discovered by the right person." "And you were the right person?" "So they say," Sarah replied, hugging her son. "But I believe the right person is simply someone who is willing to do the right thing when no one else will. Someone who protects what they love with their life. Because in the end, what you protect with your life protects you." And as the car drove away down the gravel road, leaving behind the crooked house that had changed their lives forever, Sarah knew with absolute certainty that it had all been worth it. Every tear, every humiliation, every moment of fear and doubt. Because in the end, kindness always finds its reward. Not always when we expect it, not always as we imagine it, but always. Eventually, life gives back what you give, and she had given everything she had. Her work, her dignity, her courage. And life had given her back a miracle hidden in a tilted house. Patiently waiting for the right person to open the door and discover that the greatest treasures are not those that glitter with gold and silver, they are those built with love, protected with courage, and shared with a generous heart that never forgets where it came from or whom it owes. Thanks. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next ones. God bless you.